So our next project is going to be Cabin in the Woods, and the collection we're using for this is the Modern Lodge collection from Benartex. These are all the coordinates. There's a blanket weave, this really pretty stripe, bears and deer and moose. There's this tonal, like very pretty tonal print, and then there's this other really fun blanket strip. So when I got the collection, it also had a panel with it, which is this guy. And it has 6 blocks. Let's get it going the right way for you. So we have a moose and a deer and the bear and a deer there, another bear and a wolf. And I wanted to use these in a quilt. And of course, I kind of went for low-hanging fruit, thinking, oh, cabin in the woods. So what are we going to do? We're going to do a log cabin block. So how we did it is the log cabin blocks are on the outside. There's courthouse step blocks in the middle. There's the panel blocks in the middle, and then there's this really pretty blanket print that I decided to keep whole to use out here in the corners. So in this video, we're going to talk about how to do panels, how to do courthouse steps, and how to do log cabin, and then we'll put the whole thing together. So we're ready to cut the cabin in the woods, and it starts with the cutting the panel, and I've already put my fabrics all in order according to the pattern. And I have out my itty bitty alphabet-y letters that I will pin on each fabric so that I remember which one is A, B, C, and D. We do sell these on our website. I used a hole punch to punch a hole in them to stick a safety pin in. So if you're interested, check them out at the Whimsical workshop. So the first step is to cut a panel. And when you're working with panels, it's always best to first measure the block to what the pattern says, and then I rough cut and square up. So what I mean by that is it should be an 11.5-inch square, and the square itself is 11, just shy of 11. So I'm just going to go ahead and do a 1/4 inch bigger than the panel. I don't have to be super accurate because we put a cheater border on all our panel blocks that then we square up to finish the correct size. So instead of cutting, like I said, this measures 10 3/4 by 10 7/8. I'm just gonna literally cut a 1/4 inch bigger, add my borders, and then square the whole thing up to measure 13 inches after I add the screen border here. So like I said, majority of our panel patterns, we always do this. You should always check ahead, read through the pattern, see if that's what they're doing, and that gives you a little more flexibility when you cut these. So now that I know I'm going to be cutting these a 1/4 inch bigger, I could just rough cut all of these and then square them up, which is what I think I'm going to do. So I'm just making sure I'm more than a 1/4 inch away from each square and cutting it. This just makes it go a lot faster and easier to cut them. Like, you just have to be careful that you don't accidentally cut too close to a panel so that it doesn't, it's too short. Okay, so now we've got all those cut. We just use a square ruler. You'd never know I already pressed these, but I did. And so I'm cutting a 1/4 inch bigger than the square, and sometimes, especially with these panels, they don't, they stretch a little when they're rolled on the bolt, depending on how tightly they roll it. So usually I will only cut one side at a time. And sometimes you put it on and you just have to kind of tug it to get it to where you want on the ruler. I use Creative Grids rulers because they have these grippy backs, so when I'm tugging a panel into place, the grippy back kind of helps hold them in place. If you have not tried these rulers, they're awesome because they don't slide. So if you have an issue with sliding, Creative Grid rulers are the best because of these little sandblast dots. There's my commercial for the rulers. I don't work for Creative Grids, I just really like their product. Alright, so there's one. So I'm going to go ahead and finish cutting all these up, and then we'll cut the rest of the fabrics. Alright, so we have our cabin in the woods all cut and ready to go. So first we're going to border our panels and trim them up, and then we will work on our log cabin blocks. So let's get started. Alright, so we have now sewn the borders onto the panel blocks, and I want to show you that these, see how these extend past? That was because I cut the panels 1/4 inch bigger and not 11 1/2. I think they were 11 1/4 or 11 1/8, but I wanted to make sure that this looked even, so therefore I cut this a little smaller knowing I was going to trim this up. So before I trim all of it up, I am going to get rid of this excess. I'm going to use a ruler. It's probably smarter. I'm going to get rid of the excess just so that when I go to measure it, it doesn't throw me off. It doesn't take but a couple minutes to do that, so we're going to trim it. The other thing I want to show you is that when I sew the borders onto the panel, I sew it with the border on the bottom and the panel on top in this case, so that I can follow the printed line of the panel over trying to guess by sewing it from this side. So when you have it on your machine, you would sew it panel down, the border down, panel on top for all 4. And I pressed all the seams out towards the borders. So then once I do the initial trim, we now need to cut these to be 13 inches. So I'm going to use a square ruler, and we are at 14 inches. So we are going to cut a 1/2 inch off all the sides to get to 13 inches. So I'm just seeing here, from here to here we're 14 inches. From here to here we're 14 1/4. So 1/2 inch on the sides, and then 3/8 of an inch top and bottom. And again, the top and bottom are not the same as the sides because I trimmed up this panel and the panel itself was a little bit off. But in the quilt overall, it'll look much, much nicer to have nothing sticking in here and adjust the borders as we need to. And that's why we do what we do, just to make it a lot easier and a lot prettier in the quilts. So I'm going to first trim the ends off of each, and then I will square these up. Alright, so 13 inches is 6 1/2. So one way you can do this is to find the center point of the block, okay, so now I've got a creased center line, so then I can take the ruler and I can put the 6 1/2 point on each side. And then we can just flip it over and do 13 on the other side. And there it is. There's our block. So I'll repeat that for the other 5. and these are 13 inches. And then the next step is to do the corner blocks, and these don't need to be trimmed. We're just sewing the seam, the border onto the square. And this time, when you sew any of this, but especially for this one, the borders are so narrow. You need to make sure you're very accurate with your 1/4 inch seam. So I use a clearly perfect angle. This is pretend arm of my sewing machine. I tape this clearly perfect angle down on the machine, and I use a Q-Tools sewing edge, which is just a bumper. And I use that with my 1/4 inch foot when I sew, and the bumper keeps the fabric from going out of alignment. And this here gives you the 1/4 inch line, it gives you a center line. You can also sew diagonally for flying geese and half square triangles. But these are the tools I use on all of the projects. I always have these two things taped to my machine. I did a whole video on how to perfect your 1/4 inch. I'll put the link below. But for this quilt, this is super, super important, especially when you're dealing with really narrow borders like this, because it doesn't take much to be off and for it to show. So you want to make sure you're accurate here. And then when we go to sew the log cabin blocks or the courthouse step blocks, we want to make sure our 1/4 inch seam is accurate. So that's how you're going to sew the corners and the panel blocks. So once we get these trimmed up, we'll get started on the log cabin blocks. So now we're ready to put together our log cabin block. So what I'm going to do first is I grabbed a large ruler to use as a tray so I can move this back and forth. Is I'm going to lay out the pieces, and as I lay them out, I'll remove these little tickets so they're out of my way. So this is the center, and then we will sew the little E's to the left. And this is where that 1/4 inch seam I was just talking about is so important, because you want all these to measure, come out even. So then we do those down there. So right now it looks like this is short. It's short because we haven't sewn these two together. So if you're new to quilting and you see this, don't panic. It's good, you're fine. Then we go with the F's are next. And we're gonna make 12 exactly the same, which makes it a lot easier because you can take this over to the machine and sew all of these together and press, and then sew these together and press. And it'll just go a little faster by chain sewing. And what I mean by chain sewing is you feed one piece through the machine and you don't cut it out. You sew the next piece right behind it and you'll end up with a whole chain of sewn pieces. So there's those. Then we do the G's. So the only two real important things for log cabin blocks is your 1/4 inch seam, make sure it's accurate, and pressing. You want to always press on the front of your fabric, and we're always going to be pressing out. So this will get pressed here, this will get pressed here, that'll go there, that'll go there, that'll go there, and that'll let the block lay nice and flat. Then we have these. And you know, we're making 12 of these. And then we are making 8 centers. So I just realized that these are like uneven. So we really just need 12 centers. Alright, so these are for the courthouse steps. Those are for the log cabins. Now that looks better. Alright, so I've laid out the 2 blocks. There are 8 courthouse step blocks that go in the middle of the quilt. And a courthouse step block means you sew the 2 sides to the center, and then you do the tops and bottoms. 2 sides, 2 tops and bottoms, 2 sides, 2 tops and bottoms. It looks like steps. So this is a courthouse steps block laid out. And then this one is the log cabin block. And that way you sew middle to the first piece, those 2 pieces to the next, those to the next. So this one you can only sew 1 at a time and you spiral out. For this one you can do 2 at a time as you go out. So these go faster than these, but in the end it just depends on if you're looking for more of a balanced block versus a perpendicular block. So these colors are side to side, side to side. These are opposites. So for the quilt, we needed some blocks that were going to be in the center of the quilt. Let me get a picture here. So the picture, we're creating these blended rows with the log cabins, and we're using the courthouse steps as the breaks in the pattern to give it a stop. So these would be nice braids, and then these balance them out. So I'm going to go ahead and sew the log cabins first, and then we'll do the courthouse. And when you do these, you want to press out. So this will get pressed to gray, these two will get pressed to gray, these will get pressed to brown, to blue, and that's how that's done. Same thing here, these will be pressed out each time. So all your seams will go out. And you want to make sure you take care of a 1/4 inch seam, so that's why you would use a Clearly Perfect angle and a Q-Tool sewer's edge. I'll put links for both of those below. And so now we just need to make our blocks. Okay, so these are what they look like in the package, and we're going to put a new one on my machine. They do get threads caught under them, and you have to replace them every once in a while. The one I'm replacing is probably about 4 months old, and I've done a ton of sewing. So they come in a pack of 5, so you just peel it off. Now in this case, I've already put this Clearly Perfect angle on my machine, and this line right here is my 1/4 inch. But you could also use a ruler to measure it, and then this ruler is kind of cool. I got it as a freebie from somebody. You could it has a hole at the 1/4 inch mark, so you can stick your needle in. And you can put your foot down and make sure it's perpendicular with the line on your machine. And you take the purple strip and just butt it up against that ruler and push it down. If you don't have a ruler with a hole in it, you just put the ruler underneath and crank the needle down so it sits on the 1/4 inch line. So there's that. So now I have this bumper that will keep the fabric from going past my 1/4 inch point. And because if you're trying to fix it by the time it gets to the foot, you are too late. So now I've got my angle on. You have 4 others to replace, so you got 5 months worth. Okay, so now that we've got our 1/4 inch, our Q-Tool sewing edge on, and you can see my foot, we're ready to sew our first block. This is the Courthouse step block. That's the one where if you have your center, and then you get to sew these on either side, press, sew those on either side, press. So we're gonna go ahead and sew this. We're gonna do one of these and one of the log cabins so you can see how it goes together. So here I have it, the 1/4 inch foot, the fabric is up against the edge, the fabric sits against the edge of this bumper. And we go. Alright, so now let's make the log cabin block. And the log cabin block starts with one center. And you can only sew one side at a time because we're going to go here, then to the bottom, then to this side, then to the top. And that's why it's a log cabin. So we're going to do the same thing, line it up, line up the 1/4 inch. But now I need to press this before I can do the next piece. And again, I press out towards the border. So then we're ready to put this guy on the bottom. And these two in this quilt are the same fabric. So adjacent sides match versus the Courthouse step where the fabrics match across from each other. These are two really fun blocks that you can do all kinds of stuff with. You can check out our other patterns on the Whimsical workshop. I use the Lug Cabin and the Courthouse steps in lots of designs. So there's one, there's two. Here's three. And as I build this, I usually put the bigger piece on the bottom to sew. So here is the Courthouse step block all finished. See, all my animals are going in the right direction. And so we need to make 8 more of those. And then here is the Courthouse step block. And we need to make 12 of these total. So 8 total of the Courthouse steps and 12 total of the log cabins. We have our animals going the right direction. You can see I pressed everything out. And with the guide, it makes your 1/4 inch perfect. So once we get the blocks together, we'll be ready to put the quilt top together. So here are the Courthouse step blocks. And I made a boo-boo. If you can see, this is the correct layout with the animals all in a row, and they're all pointing up. Well, I sewed 6 of them with the animals on the side. I actually sewed 7 of them with the animals on the side. But what I did is I lifted the pattern. There are 2 in the center that are your focal points. So I fixed one of these to match, and those will go in the center. And then these guys, it's gray and gray, so the color is okay. It's just that these guys they should be that way. I'm going to take a creative license, and I'm going to leave it the way it is and be happy with it. But what it does is these side ones, the animals were going to be on their side. Now those animals will be up and down. So you can choose when you make a mistake if it's just creative license and you're going to live with it, or if you're going to rip all of them back to the center to correct the error. And again, a pattern is just a guideline, so you can choose to do it either way. In this case, I'm going to use these guys as the center and these guys as the side and be happy. But I thought I'd share that little tidbit with you that even the designers make mistakes on their patterns. So now we have all the blocks done. We have our panel blocks with our silhouettes of the wilderness animals. We have our corner blocks with the blanket material framed. Then we have our Courthouse steps, the correct ones, and the ones we're going to use anyway, even though they're not correct. We're going to use some creative license and put them in. And then we finally have our log cabin blocks, which I did sew all of them correct, so they all match. So now we're ready to put the rows together into the quilt top. And I have learned over the years, I'm not sure if it really makes a difference, but for me mentally, I feel like it does. Instead of sewing blocks into rows, which in this case would be 6 rows with 5 blocks, I sew the blocks into columns. Then I only have 5 columns to sew. And then when I build the quilt, I will use the center row, and I'll sew this row on first and this row on second. Then I'll pin these two on together and sew them on this row and then this row. And then finally we'll do the little green border. So I'm gonna go ahead and get sewing, and then at the end I will show you what the quilt top looks like before we send it off to the quilter. So here is our Cabin in the Woods quilt all finished and ready to go to the long armor. You can see all the blocks sewn into rows, and you can see now how the log cabins create the lights that frame the center. Here's our Cabin in the Woods quilt back from the quilter. Monica Chrome quilted this one, and I'm going to zoom in so you can see what she quilted. It was all woodland scenes and trees and birds and leaves. It's just a very, very cool motif quilt all over. It's a little hard to see it. There's a tree, some mountains, some moose. It's very, very cute. It's something that you can sit and look at and see a different thing in it every time you look at it. This is featuring Benartex Modern Lodge fabric, and I hope you've enjoyed this quilt tutorial as we cover panel piecing and log cabin and courthouse step blocks, and how to fussy cut some of these fabrics. It was a very fun quilt to make. I hope you've enjoyed the video. Make sure you like and subscribe below, and thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and if you have, make sure you like and subscribe below. You can find the Whimsical Workshop on our website, thewhimsicalworkshop.com, and that has all links to all of our other social media platforms. Thanks for joining us.